Hi everyone, welcome back. Another live video here of Walking on Cinders, and this is the sixth chapter that we're reading now, tonight. And hopefully you're enjoying the story so far. If you're not, then sorry, but there are 32 chapters and we're only 6 in, so you've got a long way to go before the end of the book. But hopefully you're enjoying what happens so far. It's going to get better, I'll tell you that. You want to stay tuned for the rest of the novel because it does get really, really good later on. And that's not just me saying that. So let's go then with chapter 6 of my novel, Walking on Cinders. And if you hadn't noticed yet already, this is the novel and it's 10 years old this year. It came out in May of 2010. So, chapter number 6. The evening seemed to go on forever, but in fact it only lasted a mere few hours. From the very first moment he had stepped over the threshold, Chris knew it was going to be a complete disaster. He knew he would hate the whole affair and that at least one of his friends, probably Thomas, would show them all up. Standing by the bar, deep in a forced conversation with Colonel Smith, Chris heard the music start. He had never really been much of a dancer. Yes, if a girl were to come up and ask him for a dance, he would not refuse, but he just hated the way some people acted and the way that Thomas was acting right at that moment. Throughout the evening, Thomas moved around the hall and danced with every woman he could lay his hands on, sometimes getting far too close for comfort. By the time 11:30 came around, Chris had moved to the back to stand with Miss Marmalade as she chatted with some of his old comrades. He had to admit that from a distance she was quite beautiful, only not his type. Ewan arrived on the scene a few minutes later, far from sober, and then prepared Chris for the disaster number 2. At first the pair seemed to be dancing quite acceptably, but halfway through the second song, Ewan whispered something in her ear, causing all hell to break loose. Chris wondered at first where Miss Marmalade was heading to as she broke through the stage door, but he was left with no time to dwell on that, as Ewan rushed past him and headed past her, and after her. Rushed past him and headed after her, pursued by a small group of other soldiers and officials. Disasters, Chris breathed as he pushed through the crowd and headed for the hallway, always come in threes. And now, 15 minutes later, everything seemed to be calming down, or at least that was what Chris hoped. They were sitting in a large box room above the main entrance, where there was only a single window that looked down upon the street below. Ewan was standing by this window, an ice pack against the left side of his face. It didn't seem as if he wanted to talk, and the others were not surprised. Chris and Thomas had positioned themselves on 2 wooden crates by the door, and they appeared to be listening intently to a conversation that was taking place just outside in the hallway. "How is the young lady?" Colonel Smith's voice wafted in through the crack in the doorway. "It's her lad." "How is the young lady?" Colonel Smith's voice wafted in through the crack in the doorway. It's her my lads appear to be worried about the most, especially Aston. He couldn't stop apologising for what had happened, though it was nothing to do with him." "Oh no, for sure, she's fine, just fine," the manager spoke, his Irish accent always more pronounced in times of stress. "Although Miss Marmalade won't offer a word on the subject, which kind of puts me in a very sticky situation." "How do you mean?" "Well, even though he was used to speaking with all sorts of clients, Miss Marmalade's manager sometimes found the simplest of situations soon turned into a nightmare." He took a few moments to gather his thoughts and looked down the hallway. 20 minutes earlier he had stepped out onto the street to make a phone call to a very important friend. The man in question went by the name of Watson, and he held a prestigious position in the President's personal secretary. The topic of discussion was a slight amendment to the President's proposal, which saw his top-secret code stowed away on board a United plane bound for France. In short, the documents would still be transported, unbeknown to the force's sweetheart. The call had ended with Miss Marmalade's manager revealing her delight at being asked for new employment so quickly. "Well," the President's personal assistant had said slowly, "it's lucky for her that things are moving a little more quickly than we first imagined. A British general posted in the heart of rural France is awaiting her arrival, along with the documents and your 3 soldiers." Back in the hallway, the paint on the ceiling was flaking and there was a large patch of damp alongside the obvious plastic chandelier. The carpets were fraying as well, only in the corners, but it was still noticeable. The manager wondered how on earth Colonel Smith could permit himself to rent out this building, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that all the articles relating to the state of the armed forces' finances in this modern age were in fact true. "Because," the manager paused before continuing his sentence, "Miss Marmalade came to me in somewhat of a fluster this morning. I was not expecting her, of course, not for another week, but she was somehow persistent and would not leave until I promised to find her a permanent form of work." And this is to do with me because, the Colonel questioned wearily. Because as I have already relayed to Miss Marmalade herself, tomorrow morning the President has insisted that she take the final seat on the same jet as your soldiers. I've engineered for her position entertaining the troops in central France. Turning away for a split second, Colonel Smith gulped and considered the prospect. It suddenly came to mind that the British were withholding some kind of intelligence. I bet she was very happy about that one, wasn't she? Barked Chris, bursting out of the room, causing the Colonel to turn back in surprise. Following in his wake was a half-sober Thomas, his signature smile plastered to his face. I don't think happy is the right word to describe it, the manager answered, a little surprised, yet happy for the diversion. She didn't protest, and I thought she might do. She agreed to go. She said that it was kind of me to find a placement at such short notice, and that she knew it might be weeks before I could find another one if she decided not to go ahead. Well, that's a little strange, Chris retorted, cutting the manager off once again. His visions of a troublesome future were beginning to rear their ugly head. Swinging the door on its hinges so that it opened with a bang against the wall, Chris pointed towards a figure slumped by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. That, he said, is the reason why I find it strange. Why would someone like Miss Marmalade want to spend any longer with soldiers like him? Someone who obviously caused her great discomfort this evening. That surprised me, her manager replied, but what shocked me the most was at the moment before I left the room to make my way up here, Marmalade asked if I could bring that young man back with me. It would seem she wants a private word with him. This time the manager gestured towards the slumped figure. There is definitely something going on, Thomas replied with a hiccup, the first thing he said to his friend all night. I have no idea at all how you managed to land a girl like Miss Marmalade. Chris shook his head and sighed. While her manager tried in vain to smooth things over with Colonel Smith, Miss Marmalade had been sitting in her dressing room deep in thought. Tonight had been a little unnerving, but there was no way she was going to let it affect her future. So she thought, as she slid her hand around the hot mug of tea and took a sip, this is what it feels like for the secret to be out, for someone to finally know. She contemplated this for a few moments, yet he seemed to know who she was, but he'd only recognised her face. He didn't know her name. If she really didn't want the truth to be out, then Miss Marmalade could just deny everything, and then, to be safe, she could claim that he was too drunk to remember clearly. There was one problem, though. One thing that prompted her to make entirely the opposite decision. It was one simple sentence. I simply couldn't forget that pretty face. For the second time that evening, there was a knock at the door. By now the hands on the clock were showing an early hour of the morning, and Miss Marmalade was in no mood for talking. She had tried to explain herself earlier, and she doubted she could do a better job now, especially after the 3 glasses of wine. At the time, she convinced herself these were only to calm her nerves. Enter, she said rather hoarsely, preparing herself for the onslaught. The door opened with a click, and that strange and familiar face appeared. Hello, Ewan Roberts began, fumbling a great deal over his words. Your manager said you wanted to see me. It seemed the effects of a drink had not worn off to any great extent, for he still wore a confident, yet altogether far too silly smile on his face. Well, yes, I did, Miss Marmalade replied, dropping her guard a little and almost hinting at a smile. There must be something in his presence, she thought again. Just don't get too soppy. But there was no need to worry. The drink they had both consumed more than dispersed any tension in the air. What's your real name, then? Ewan smiled, walking haphazardly towards the desk and flicking the switch for the tiny bulbs that surrounded the mirror. My real... Yeah, Miss Marmalade's just a stage name, right? I mean, it's nice on toast, but that's about as far as it goes. Oh, yeah, I suppose, but I prefer Jam myself. Ewan screwed up his face for a second. Miss Jam? Well, that doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it? She couldn't help but smile inside. A moment arrived and clung in the air. So he's witty and good-looking, she thought. Jennifer, she replied hastily. That's my real name. Oh, it's lovely. So, is that the one you use at the cafe? When you're all dressed up like you were this morning? What's the deal with that, anyway? For a moment, Jennifer couldn't quite believe she was doing this. It was far too early in the morning to be standing in her famous alter ego's dressing room and chatting with the first man who was interested in her as a real person. Earlier in the evening, she had convinced herself that 12 o'clock would come and it would all go pear-shaped, just as it had done for Cinderella. But as the moment passed, she had found a new air of confidence. It was only then that she realised Ewan was looking directly at her, staring into her eyes and waiting for her to reveal all. Deep down, she knew that he would not leave until he knew the truth. But she didn't need to worry about that, because for the first time in her life, she wanted to tell someone. She wanted to let this charming soldier boy in. Without a second thought, Jennifer hoisted herself up onto the desk next to where Ewan was standing and began her story. She told him about the flat, her family situation, the pros and cons of modern life in the capital, and how she became Miss Marmalade. Most importantly, she told him what had happened earlier in the day, how she had headed into London on a normal morning ready for work and had arrived to find the place blown to pieces. Then she told him about how she noticed a soldier standing in the furthest corner of the road, silent and unmoving. And then of a visit to her manager and the secure job he had organised for her. When she had at last finished, Jennifer realised that Ewan had been listening intently, and she soon came to realise that he was genuinely pleased to have been told the whole story. And I promise you now, Ewan smiled after a short pause, I will not tell Chris or Thomas anything about our extra passenger. Jennifer just smiled. Well, I'd much prefer to see their faces when they realise. This time she positively beamed, so that she found herself drawn into a close embrace with the handsome man before her. It's only a hug, she thought, as they parted again. There had been an immediate connection, both knew it, but neither knew how to admit it. Slowly, Ewan moved his hand up and around Jennifer's shoulders. When she in turn drew closer, he smiled and looked her up and down. You really are beautiful, he said quietly. I have to admit, I never really understood what the other guys saw. What do you mean? Jennifer replied, pulling away a little. She was becoming more and more intrigued by this man every minute that passed. She longed to know more about him. Well, I mean, you're stunning, but to me, I see you as more than that. Ever since I've been here, I've noticed something different, something deeper. For a moment, Jennifer wondered if the drink was making him say these things. How could he read her so well? Oh, well, I don't know what to say to that, she replied. That really is one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me. It means a lot, Ewan. The soldier was only trying to express his feelings in words, but it appeared neither was able to do so. To her, he was attractive in so many ways, from his messy hair and dark eyes to his awkward smile. He was tall, too. She felt safe with him, and although he was a soldier, he seemed to have no lack of compassion, unlike the others. To him, she was the epitome of beauty. It seemed as if everything he had ever loved in the few girls he had known in the past was encompassed within her. Her long blonde hair was gorgeous, and her blue eyes almost piercing. They were wide and bright, with long eyelashes that curled up to meet her sparkling eyeshadow. To him, it did not matter that she was famous. He knew he would love her anyway. They could not express their immediate feelings in words, or the moments in the dressing room that followed. It was all too sudden and new. Instead, there was a mutual understanding that feelings were far easier conveyed in a physical fashion. And as the silence between them became unbearable, acting like two young children, shy and alone in the dressing room, Ewan leaned forwards and brought their lips together. Jennifer did not pull away at the first kiss. It was like tiny fireworks erupting between them. From the time they parted, everything was different. Now they understood each other. That this new and exciting feeling was shared. That each felt the same. Jennifer didn't want it to end. She loved the feeling of escape she gained from kissing this man. Is this love at first sight? Ewan whispered, running his hands through her long hair. She smiled and nodded, but at the same time drew away a little, remembering something important. Ewan, she said slowly, there's something else you need to know. The soldier pulled a face, confused. Jennifer took the chance to continue. I've been approached by the government several times in the last few weeks. It was the wrong thing to say, the wrong time. It would ruin the atmosphere, but she had to tell him. Well, they want me to carry secret documents for the United Army to France. But why you? Ewan asked almost immediately. It was the obvious response. Well, they think I would be a target. They believe even the Reformed Army wouldn't attack me because I'm the force's sweetheart. Ewan screwed up his face again. Well, I guess that does make a little sense, he said simply. Jennifer was surprised. But I didn't accept. I said no every time. I couldn't take the risk. Well, that's understandable. Jennifer wanted him to understand in every possible way. Do you believe me, Ewan? Can I trust you? This time there was no hesitation. Of course I believe you, and you can trust me 100%. What did I say about keeping our additional passenger a secret? Jennifer smiled both inside and out. Revealing this and gaining his trust meant everything, and it proved he was genuine. But there was even more to come. Jennifer, Ewan asked suddenly, immediately looking deep into his eyes. Yes, she replied, a little sheepishly. There was a moment's pause. Kiss me. By the time Jennifer listened to his footsteps padding down the hallway, it was all too much. Her mind was filled with so many thoughts of a day's events. For once those footsteps did not mean a horrible goodbye, but instead they led to a world of new beginnings. It was 2:30 in the morning by the time Chris and Ewan and Thomas piled into the back of the hovercar that was parked outside. It's a good job I didn't have anything to drink tonight, Chris sighed as the others fought with the back seat belts. Oh, I doubt that we'd had either of you drive in the reformed state of Tuwaki, and that's saying something. Oh, but it was worth it though, wasn't it? Ewan piped up. It was the first thing he'd said to his friend since the incident. How'd you work that one out? Thomas pondered, dropping his cap to his knees. Well, there weren't many girls there. I should know. I danced with those that were there. Oh, you're just besotted, aren't you, Ewan? Chris said calmly as he put the hover car into gear and pulled into the road. I mean, just because you get to dance with the most famous girl in London doesn't mean you're in love with her. I saw that look in your eyes, and I've seen it with many others before you. One look and she has you. All she has to do is reel you in. For the rest of the journey back to the barracks, nobody spoke. Chris felt sure that he had laid the situation to rest, and besides, he couldn't be bothered to take it any further. Why should he have to act the father figure anyway? It was just another battle he could do without. The buildings that remained on London's South Bank passed by like evil giants that blocked out the stars. Once this had been the smartest place in the capital, the location of upmarket apartments in the new business district. Each night the buildings had lit up the Thames like giant fireflies. But that was before the war broke out and the president's right-hand man had since imposed a blackout scheme across the city, which he hoped would deter any possibility of a reformed air attack. Most Londoners couldn't see the point, and Chris especially noted the fact that the country seemed to be digressing. He always maintained that it reminded him of the blackouts from the Second World War, which he had studied at school. And so the journey went on in the same monotonous silence. It was not a particularly long journey, it just seemed that way. It wasn't until they had passed the third traffic light and turned into the circular roundabout that Thomas finally remembered the question that had been on his lips all evening. So, what exactly did you whisper to her then, lover boy? He grinned, putting on a mock French accent. And what did she say to you in her room? Well, not to say more to the point. I've heard she's one of those girls who prefers to get straight down to business. There was a sudden sigh from the front of the car as Chris realised there was nothing in his power that could stop Thomas from behaving like a complete imbecile, and a few seconds later Thomas himself realised that he had just put his foot in it big time. I was only joking, he said, giving Ewing a jab in the ribs. Come on, you're never going to see her again. We can at least have a laugh about that. But Ewan knew this wasn't true, and Chris knew it as well. In fact, it was only Thomas who had forgotten that tomorrow morning the amazing Miss Marmalade would be joining them on a flight destined for France. With a last buzz of the engine, the hover car pulled into the empty car park at the Thames Regimental Barracks, and the three men clambered out of the cold morning air. The buildings looked grey and uninviting, and as they reached door on cabin number 32... The buildings looked grey and uninviting, and as they reached the door on cabin 232, you couldn't help wondering if tomorrow would be the best or the worst day of his life.